There are stories the land itself tries to swallow. Some sink beneath salt marsh and sand. Others stay whispering through walls, refusing to be buried. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. Tonight we go south again to the low country of South Carolina, spring of 1834, where the air was thick with brine and morning, and the night carried the sound of iron chains dragged across shell roads. What survives of this story comes from three sources: a planter's private ledger recovered from a burned house near Owendo Creek, a physician's unsigned notes preserved in the archives of the Charleston Medical College, and a single torn page from a Baptist parish record. Together they trace the first appearance of a man known only as Elias, later remembered by rumor and whisper as Elias the Mute. The page in the ledger is dated April 3rd. Its ink is brown with age, the handwriting uneven as though written in haste. It reads, "Purchased today one male bondsman name given Elias, age indeterminate, perhaps 20 or 22. Physically sound but marked by old wound to throat, voice absent, price reduced accordingly. No surname, no origin, no note of parentage, only that wound and its silence." The entry is signed by Alaric Bonneau, owner of the Bonneau Cane Works, a plantation built on reclaimed tidal marsh north of Charleston. The Bonneaus were an old family, French Huguenot by descent, their wealth founded on indigo, later sugarcane. Their ledgers were meticulous: the quantities of crop yield, the number of slaves, the expenses of feed, cloth, medicine, punishment. Every life on that land was accounted for in ink and arithmetic. But Elias appears only once more in the Bonneau record books. 6 months later, listed under losses: Elias Mute Field Hand, escaped or deceased, October 8, value written off. That should have been the end of it. One entry erased, one life vanished. But the physician's notes unsigned, written in that precise sterile script common among antebellum doctors, suggest that Elias's disappearance was not simple at all. The pages were found among a collection of anatomical sketches at the Old Medical College of South Carolina, filed under aberrant injuries, rural cases. One page carries a date that matches the ledger almost exactly: October. The physician describes treating a gentleman of some social distinction from the St. Andrews Parish District, a Mr. Julien Bonneau, age 37, who had been found at his plantation grievously injured in a manner too indecent to be described. The doctor's language is clinical but trembling around the edges. He writes of mutilation of the generative organs, of clean incision inconsistent with animal attack, and of evidence suggesting human agency. There are no direct names in that entry other than the victim's own, but in the margin, written in smaller hand, someone, perhaps the same doctor, added one word: mute. Those who've studied these documents believe this was the first known assault attributed to Elias, but at the time it was treated as an isolated crime. The local sheriff, Hiram Cutler, wrote that the perpetrator was unknown, presumed to be one of the field hands. Though no trace was ever found, the surviving records show no follow-up, no inquiry into motive or pattern. Bonneau recovered partially from his wounds but withdrew from public life, citing chronic infirmity. His plantation continued under overseer management until his death in 18. No one in the parish mentioned the attack again, at least not in writing. Yet oral accounts from the 1870s collected by a northern missionary during Reconstruction suggest a different memory persisted among the formerly enslaved. In those recollections, hushed, fearful, and uncertain, there was talk of a mute man who came in the night. He was said to have worked briefly at the Bonneau plantation, silent as the river, and to have vanished after a storm. Months later, the master was found screaming wordlessly in his chamber, blood spreading through the floorboards like spilled molasses. One woman interviewed in 1872, recorded only as Aunt Hester, aged near 90, told the interviewer, "We call him the one who took their voices. He couldn't speak, so he make them silent same way. No sound left in them after." The interviewer dismissed her statement as superstition, but her phrasing, "make them silent same way," would later echo in multiple accounts, implying an act both literal and symbolic. Elias did not kill. He unmade what his masters used to harm. The Baptist record, the third source, offers one more sliver of evidence. It is a torn half-sheet, the ink faded but legible. It appears to be a baptismal register, dated August 1834, listing conversions among the enslaved at various plantations. The last name on the page reads, Elias, adult baptism performed by Reverend Joseph Reed, Bonneau Parish. Beside the name in faint pencil someone had added, "could not repeat vowel motioned assent," and beneath that, in another hand, "voice lost by cruelty." The Reverend's own notes no longer survive, but his successor at the St. Andrew's Church, Reverend Thomas Bracknell made a remark 2 decades later in a sermon journal that seems to reference this case. He wrote, "I have read of one man who suffered grievously by the wickedness of others, and whose silence became his mark. It was said that when he was baptized, the waters trembled." If Bracknell's note truly refers to Elias, it suggests that even among the clergy, the story lingered as something more than rumor, something half-remembered, half-believed, a haunting too real to name aloud. By 1835, the Bonneau family had replaced nearly all of their enslaved field workers after what was recorded as runaways and mysterious illness. Locals whispered that the marsh itself had turned against them, that the soil grew saltier each season, that the cane rotted before harvest. Some claimed to have seen a figure standing at the edge of the tidal flats at night, still and listening, as if waiting for a sound that never came. Others said that when thunder rolled over the river, it carried with it a strange echo, like a cry trying to form a word but strangled before it reached the air. Was Elias real? The archival fragments say yes, but the pattern that would later emerge, the other men, the repetition of injuries, the silence surrounding each event, did not begin until years later. In 1834, what happened at Bonneau Plantation was only the first tremor. Historians who've examined these early records describe something consistent with what they call archival erasure. Moments in the record where events are clearly implied but the specifics are removed, names blacked out, dates altered, motives marked only as unknown. When traced across neighboring counties, those erasures begin to form a map, a line of plantations stretching from Owendo Creek to Kingstree, all linked by a common rumor of a mute field hand passing through, and each linked to a man of standing found maimed but alive. Those who still live in the low country call it the Silence Trail, a phrase that appears nowhere before the 20th century, but echoes a story older than emancipation. Some say it's metaphorical. Others whisper that if you walk that trail on certain humid nights, the frogs and crickets stop their song all at once, and for a few breaths the world becomes as silent as Elias himself. The physical record ends there, 1834, but the silences in the archives speak as loudly as any confession. We do not yet know why Elias did what he did. We do not know what wound first took his voice, or what he endured that made him turn against those who held his life in their legend. We only know that by the end of that year, one man could no longer speak, and another could no longer father children, and that both fates would echo through every plantation from Charleston to Georgetown for the next 13 years. Next time we'll follow the trail north, to Kingshare Parish, where in 1836 another plantation master was found maimed in nearly identical fashion, and where the legend of Elias the Mute began to take root among those who labored under the sun. We pick up in 1836, 2 years after the first recorded mutilation at the Bonneau Plantation. The surviving documents from that period are few, and most of them deliberately vague, but certain patterns, visible only in hindsight, begin to take shape here in property ledgers, in physicians' letters, in whispers recorded decades later by Reconstruction journalists. The first hint appears in the estate papers of Samuel Kingshare, a rice planter whose property lay upriver from Georgetown. On June 14, 1836, Kingshare's overseer entered a terse notation: master attacked in his chamber before dawn, throat spared, genitals destroyed, perpetrator escaped into swamp, suspect a field hand recently hired from Bonneau estate. No name was given for that hired hand, and no subsequent documentation confirms whether he was ever caught, but a parallel entry in the county court's docket lists runaway slave, mute, name uncertain, possibly Elias. That name appears crossed out later in the margin, replaced with the word deceased. It would not be the last time his death was recorded prematurely. For the next decade, 8 such incidents would occur between 1836 and 1847, all in a narrow corridor of plantations along the Santee River basin. In each case, an adult white male landowner attacked in his home, surviving with grievous mutilation. In each case, no intruder apprehended, and in nearly every case, the victim had recently come into possession of a rented bondsman, whose voice was damaged or absent entirely. To plantation society this was coincidence. To later historians, it became evident. The earliest surviving correspondence that links these events comes from Dr. Alphonse Dupré, a French-trained physician, who treated planters across the Low Country during the. In a letter dated August 1836, he wrote to a colleague in Savannah, "I have attended 3 gentlemen now in this district, whose injuries are of identical form and execution. Each attributes the act to a deranged Negro, yet the cuts are so precise, so calculated, that they seem rather the work of one whose silence has made him study anatomy by observation, if not by training. The precision is almost surgical. I cannot explain it. The idea of a slave possessing surgical precision was, to Dupre's contemporary, unthinkable, but the injury descriptions, exact incisions, avoidance of major vessels, survival of all victims, pointed to something deliberate. It was not blind rage. It was correction. The Kingshire Plantation ledger mentions that after the attack the overseers brought in bloodhounds, combing the marshes for 2 days. The only sign they found was a half-submerged wooden rosary, hand-carved from river oak missing its cross. The object was kept for years in the family home as a curiosity, until a fire destroyed the house in 1869, a descendant described it in a letter to the Charleston Courier as a relic from the night the mute came. That letter is the first known written use of the name Elias the Mute. By 1837 the attacks had become the subject of rumor among enslaved communities from Charleston to Beaufort. The stories varied. In some, Elias was an avenging spirit, who punished masters who violated their servants. In others he was a living man, scarred by cruelty, moving between plantations under false names, striking only when the old wounds reopened. The tales were told in whispers by the riverbank after curfew. One fragment, preserved in the diary of an abolitionist teacher, reads, "He walk like shadow, and he listen. When they think him dumb he hear them say what they do, then he take what they took." The teacher, identified as Abigail Shaw, dismissed the tale as superstition bred from fear, but her transcription matches other oral retellings almost word for word. Even among those who refused to believe in ghosts, the name Elias had begun to mean something. Silence that walked. In the winter of 1838, another pattern emerged, not in blood, but in paper. Reverend Thomas Bracknell, the same clergyman who had once noted Elias's baptism, recorded an unsettling conversation in his parish journal. A planter named Merritt Harlan visited him after service. Pale and trembling, the Reverend wrote, Mr. Harlan confessed unease, saying he felt himself haunted by one of his own field hands, a mute man of unknown origin, who stared upon him with something like knowledge. The man disappeared soon after, and Mr. Harlan took to sleeping armed. He fears the fate of Bon. Bracknell concluded dryly, I counseled him toward prayer. 6 months later, Harlan was found in his bedchamber, bleeding but alive. His account to the sheriff survives only in a paraphrase. He came like a shadow, his face lit by lightning, and he said nothing at all. Modern archivists have pieced together that these incidents followed a geographical logic. Each plantation lay within a day's walking distance of the next. The estimated travel path: Bono, 1834, Kingshire, 1836, Harlan, 1838, traces a rough arc through the marshlands toward Georgetown. It was the same corridor used by enslaved laborers loaned out seasonally between plantations. Elias's movement could have been hidden within those transfers, one mute worker among hundreds. But what makes these records remarkable is not just the recurrence of violence, it's the consistent suppression of motive. Each surviving plantation ledger describes the attacks as rebellion, savagery, or unprovoked mutilation. None mention the word that appears in Reverend Bracknell's later notes. Bracknell's journal for January 1839 contains a single uncharacteristically angry entry. What they call unspeakable sin is precisely that, unspeakable. The silence they fear is their own. If the events of 1834 had been treated as anomaly, by 1839 they had become an epidemic no one wished to acknowledge. Sheriff Hiram Cutler, who had overseen the Bono investigation 5 years earlier, sent a confidential memorandum to the governor's office that year, now preserved in the state archive. It reads in part, I am pressed to address recurring outrages of like nature across the coastal district. The pattern of injury, method, and circumstance are identical. Victims are men of standing. In all cases, the suspect is an enslaved male, sometimes described as mute or disfigured about the throat. Given the absence of apprehensions, I begin to suspect the same hand in all. But Cutler's memo was never acted upon. The plantation elite closed ranks, preferring silence to scandal. The attacks were treated as isolated madness. Within months, even the sheriff's own copies of his letters disappeared from county files. That deliberate forgetting would persist for over a century. In 1840, a planter named Drayton Cobb, known for his interest in scientific improvement of the Negro, claimed he had performed restorative operations on several mute slaves to test the possibility of nerve recovery. Among his surviving papers is a brief description of one patient, subject male, approximately 30 years, throat wound long healed, speech impossible though comprehension intact. When shown medical tools, subject became violently distressed, procedure aborted. The note is unsigned but initial DC,
Scholars believe this patient may have been Elias captured, experimented upon, and later escaped. The same year another planter was attacked in Berkeley County, his wounds matching the prior case. The map of violence grew wider, the pattern more deliberate. What makes the Elias case so haunting to historians is not just the cruelty of his revenge, but the clinical indifference with which every record surrounding him was written. Plantation doctors and sheriffs described the physical evidence with precision, yet treated motive as irrelevant, as though cause and consequence could not coexist when the victim was white and the perpetrator enslaved. But if you read between the ledgers, the gaps where names were blotted out, the lines rewritten in another hand, you see the other narrative begin to bleed through. One man's body used, broken, then turned into the instrument of its own justice. By 1841, 7 years after the first Bono assault, the trail of silence had become a grim undercurrent in plantation gossip. The name Elias was rarely spoken aloud. To utter it was considered unlucky. Overseers posted guards, owners slept armed, and yet the attacks continued, always under thunder, always without a word spoken. In the margins of his...
The third discovery came not from the courthouse or the plantation house, but from an object that had been kept hidden in a locked drawer beneath the rector's desk, a small leather-bound notebook covered in mildew and dried salt. Its spine was broken, its pages faintly warped from humidity, yet the ink remained legible. Reverend Clay's initials were pressed into the cover, along with the date March 1847. The entries inside did not resemble sermons or parish notes. They were written in short, clinical lines, as though the author feared being overheard by the page itself. Each note was accompanied by an observation about the subject, which Clay identified only by a single letter. S exhibits no verbal capacity but expresses awareness through gaze and gesture. The throat shows signs of deliberate intervention. An incision not fully healed, possibly medical, possibly punitive. No infection present. Pulse steady, eyes lucid. March. That single passage unsettled every historian who later handled the notebook. It read less like a confession and more like a physician's log. Except Clay was no physician. His training was in divinity, not anatomy, though his writings revealed a preoccupation with both. He described in detail the science of silence, a term he seemed to have coined himself. He wrote of the moral anatomy of sin, that words were the organs of conscience, and to lose them was to be rendered spiritually ambiguous. He saw S not only as a man robbed of speech, but as a living testament to something the plantation system had long buried, the idea that silence could be engineered. The entries became darker after that. I begin to suspect that S was made this way intentionally. There are patterns in the tissue too precise to be accidental, not a crude punishment, but an operation. March 23, 1847. Clay was describing without understanding what would now be recognized as an early and brutal form of experimental surgery. Crude, secret and unrecorded, yet his language remained theological. He wrote of purification, of divine correction. The horror lay not in what was done but in how calmly it was described. A later page, stained with candle grease, contained a passage that scholars still debate. The masters called it mercy to quiet the disobedient by cutting the root of noise. But S's silence is not mercy. It is a wound that remembers. Here the Reverend seemed to grasp the enormity of what he had witnessed. His journal revealed a dawning awareness that the silence of one man stood for something vast and systemic, the calculated erasure of testimony itself. And yet Clay did not take action. He continued to write, to study, to observe, even as he confessed that every observation felt like an intrusion upon the divine. Meanwhile, the authorities in Georgetown moved to suppress any record of what had been uncovered at the plantation. Sheriff Carr filed a terse memorandum on March 25, noting that the case of the mute laborer would be closed pending private adjudication. His official tone disguised a deep unease. He had begun to notice inconsistencies in the witness accounts, dates that didn't match, locations that shifted depending on who was speaking. It was as if the entire history of the man they called the Silent had been rewritten several times over, each revision designed to protect someone. By this point, local rumor had already taken hold. They said the silent man could hear the thoughts of those who wronged him. They said his stillness was contagious, that one glance from him could still the tongue for days. The superstitious whispers grew so pervasive that field hands refused to sleep near the holding shed where he was confined. Even the guards began reporting dreams of choking, of words dying on their lips before they could speak. Carr, ever the skeptic, ordered that the prisoner be transferred to the courthouse jail. It was there that Reverend Clay resumed his visits, under the pretense of spiritual care. but what he wrote in his notebook suggests something closer to interrogation. He does not pray when prompted, but he closes his eyes when I mention forgiveness. Is that refusal or comprehension? I find myself envying his quiet, the kind that no sermon can reach. March. The following day, Clay recorded a final entry. I asked S whether the silence was his punishment or his refuge. He raised his hand, palm up, trembling, and drew a line in the dust between us. Then he covered it with his hand. I believe he meant that there is no difference. Punishment and refuge are the same thing. After this, the notebook ends abruptly. A torn page suggests that at least one more entry existed, but was removed, likely by Clay himself, or perhaps by those who came after, seeking to sanitize the record. When the notebook resurfaced in 1973, catalogued as Item 14C, Unprocessed Clerical Materials, Georgetown Diocese, the archivist who examined it reported a smell of salt and decay inconsistent with paper of this age. The ink, tested years later, contained traces of iodine, a common antiseptic in the mid-19th century. This detail led researchers to a disturbing possibility. The Reverend's notes may have been written using a medical solution drawn from the same instruments used on. The horror then was not just in the words but in the medium of the writing itself. History literally recorded in the fluid of its own violation. The theological school at Charleston still houses the notebook in a climate-controlled case. Visitors are not permitted to photograph it. Those who have seen it describe an almost imperceptible sound when the case is opened, a faint rasp like a whisper caught in cloth. Some claim it's the paper shifting. Others say it's air escaping from between the pages, trapped for over a century. But there are a few archivists, custodians, the night security staff, who insist it sounds unmistakably like breath. In the months that followed the Reverend's encounters with S, the atmosphere in Georgetown grew feverish. Reports circulated of livestock found dead without marks, of tools missing, of mirrors cracking spontaneously in the courthouse hall. Sheriff Carr wrote in a private letter, later preserved by his great-grandson, "It is as though silence itself has waked now. The air thickens before a storm, and people hush mid-sentence, as if expecting a reprimand from the empty room." He described his own unease with the man he'd confined, not fear of violence, but of something stranger, an uncanny patience. "He waits," Carr wrote, "as if listening for a word that none of us dare to speak." Clay's health deteriorated rapidly that spring. His sermons became erratic, his handwriting less steady. Parishioners remembered him staring at the altar for long stretches, whispering fragments of phrases, tongue of dust, voice beneath the root. His final sermon, delivered in April, ended abruptly when he collapsed mid-sentence. Parish records state he suffered a nervous affliction. Privately, his daughter later recalled that he had been haunted by the memory of a man who would not speak, and of a silence that grew each time he prayed. The last official mention of S before his disappearance came from Carr's ledger, dated April 13, 1847, noting transfer delayed due to illness. The next page is blank. Some have speculated that Clay's missing notebook entry and Carr's missing prisoner are connected, that the Reverend may have facilitated an escape or that the authorities staged one to conceal what they could not publicly explain. Others believe S died in confinement, and that the omission was deliberate, designed to erase the conclusion of a story too dangerous to tell. Whatever the truth, what remained was the echo, the shared silence that settled over Georgetown like humidity, seeping into paper, memory, and by the end of that summer, half the town refused to speak of the events at all. The Reverend's church closed within a year. Carr resigned his post and withdrew to a coastal homestead, where he would live out his final years, keeping meticulous weather diaries but never again recording a human name. In 2003, when historian Dr. Michelle Torres cross-referenced Clay's journal with Carr's letters, she noticed something others had missed. Every date associated with S coincided with documented outbreaks of aphonia, sudden, unexplained loss of voice, reported by plantation overseers in the surrounding county. Nearly a dozen men and women, all unrelated, had lost their ability to speak for days or weeks at a time, only to recover without medical intervention. The phenomenon was dismissed as hysteria, heat stroke or malarial complication. But Torres proposed another explanation, a psychological contagion, born of collective repression and guilt. She called it the silence epidemic of 1847, and her theory, controversial, half-believed, suggested that what began as one man's mutilated throat had become a regional haunting of conscience. When a people suppress testimony long enough, she wrote, their silence ceases to be absence, it becomes a living presence, a contagion of forgetting. Her paper was never formally published. The review board rejected it as overly speculative, but the archives record that, within 6 months of her withdrawal,
Torres herself stopped speaking in public. She communicated thereafter only by handwritten notes. No one ever asked why. When the Reverend Clay's notebook ended, another document began. It appeared nearly a decade later, catalogued in the private correspondence of Dr. Horace Bellamy, an itinerant physician who served the coastal parishes of South Carolina during the years before the war. His surviving letters, brittle and rust-colored, were discovered in 1909 within a cedar chest marked Medical Curiosities, HB. Among these letters one stood out, written to an unknown correspondent Charleston, and bearing no signature, only a wax seal pressed with the symbol of a serpent swallowing its own tail. The letter was dated April 18, 1847, 3 days after the last recorded mention of the silent. The body arrived at dawn, unclaimed and unconfessed, no name attached, only a notation: mute, Negro deceased, in custody. I was instructed to examine the remains before burial, under orders from Sheriff Carr himself. His tone suggested haste, perhaps guilt. The throat, yes, the throat was opened twice, once in life, once in death. The second incision, crude, frantic. I am unsure which hand performed it. The handwriting slanted downward, as if the pen itself had grown weary. Bellamy described what he found with unsettling precision, not gore, but pattern. The laryngeal tissue bore symmetrical marks, inconsistent with violence or surgery performed in ignorance. These were calculated alterations. Someone had known exactly what to remove and what to leave intact. He concluded, this was no punishment, it was procedure. That sentence changed the direction of every historian who came after. If the Reverend's journal represented moral torment, Bellamy's letter embodied the horror of professional curiosity, the transformation of human suffering into data. Bellamy's career had already placed him at the intersection of faith and flesh. Trained at the Medical College of South Carolina, he'd written essays on moral physiognomy, the belief that virtue could be mapped onto the human body. His surviving notebooks from the 1840s contained sketches of skulls, annotated with words like temperance, vice, and submission. To him, silence was not simply absence but a physiological condition. He believed that by altering the body, one might alter the soul. So when the mutilated mute was brought to his table, Bellamy saw not a crime but a case. He wrote of nerve clusters resembling the root of language, and speculated whether speech could be surgically extinguished, whether a man's moral disobedience could be stilled by excising the impulse to speak. If sin begins in the tongue, he wrote, perhaps grace begins in its absence. It was not blasphemy he intended, at least not consciously. It was science filtered through theology, the same warped logic that governed much of antebellum medicine, that suffering could be justified if it revealed divine design. Bellamy's subsequent experiments were never formally recorded, but fragmentary notes survive in the archives of the old Charleston Infirmary. He referred obliquely to a sequence of test subjects procured from parish holdings, describing their throats, lungs and chests in meticulous detail, how sound trembled through damaged tissue, how whisper replaced speech, how silence seemed to spread like a fever. The Reverend Clay's influence is visible between the lines, phrases lifted directly from the earlier journal. The wound that remembers, the quiet that binds, recur in Bellamy's later writings, suggesting he had obtained Clay's notes or copies thereof. Whether the two men corresponded remains unknown, though Clay's daughter later testified that a doctor from Charleston visited her father in the spring of 1847, shortly before his breakdown. If so, Bellamy may have inherited more than papers. He may have inherited the silence itself. By 1849, Bellamy's letters had grown erratic. He wrote of waking to find his own voice faltering, his tongue heavy and uncooperative. He described phantom throats, the sensation of another's breath rising within his own. Servants in his house reported hearing him speak in his sleep, though the words were indistinct, like water boiling behind a wall. One note, written in a shaking hand, reads simply, around the same time, Georgetown residents began reporting a new series of disappearances. 3 field workers and 1 overseer vanished within the space of 6 weeks. In each case, neighbors recalled hearing a sound just before the disappearance, not a cry but a muffled exhalation, like the moment before speech, nothing else. Carr, now retired, wrote a private memorandum to the district magistrate, suggesting a connection. His letter, unearthed in 1971, ends with the words, I believe the contagion was never buried with the body. It moves through remembrance itself. The Charleston Medical Society censured him for conducting unauthorized dissections, and his papers were seized during an inspection. Most were destroyed. A few were quietly preserved by colleagues fascinated by his theory of spiritual pathology. Among those fragments is one remarkable diagram, a cross-section of a human neck, overlaid with a spiral of script that reads in Latin, Vox Dei perditus est, the voice of God is lost. At the spiral's center, Bellamy drew a small circle labeled. Scholars disagree whether the initial referred to the silent man, or to the concept of silence itself, rendered as a specimen, pinned and studied. The document is dated May 1849, 2 years after the death of the man whose throat he examined. Bellamy's death came suddenly and quietly in the coroner's report, sparse and unsigned, lists respiratory failure as cause of death, but the attending nurse's testimony, preserved in a private letter to her sister, suggests something stranger. He died sitting up, mouth open, no sound. It was as if the air refused. The look on his face, not pain, not fear, but waiting. No autopsy was performed. The body was interred in the physician's cemetery behind the college. Within weeks, rumors spread among students that his grave emitted a faint hum at dusk, as though the man beneath were still trying to explain himself. After Bellamy's death, his few remaining possessions were inventoried by the college. Among them was a small wooden box containing an ivory throat model, carved in exact anatomical detail. Inside the hollow of the windpipe, written in ink, were the words, "He speaks through us." No one could determine whose hand had written it. The box was sealed and placed in storage, where it remained for over a century until rediscovered by graduate researcher Dr. Michelle Torres during her 2003 investigation. She described the object in her field notes. The craftsmanship is exquisite, not decorative, but devotion. It appears to be both medical tool and reliquary. When held to the ear, one hears a resonance like a conch shell, except the tone seems to follow the listener's breath. She recommended it be preserved under controlled conditions due to auditory instability, a phrase not found in any conservation manual. From this point, the narrative fracture, the reverend's faith, the sheriff's shame, and the doctor's curiosity converge into what scholars now refer to as the Silence Archive, a collection of partial truths orbiting a single missing center. No living witness ever recorded what truly happened to the man called, yet across every surviving document, journal, letter, diagram, his absence becomes a presence, an infection of history itself. Those who studied him reported a gradual erosion of voice, as if transcription were contagious. By the late 1850s, even the plantation records begin to reflect a pattern. Inventories listing unnamed laborers marked only by a dash, overseers signing ledgers with blank spaces where names should be. Silence had become administrative, and when war came, fire did the rest. The courthouse burned in 1865, destroying Carr's original files. Bellamy's surviving sketches were lost in the flood of 1886. Clay's church was dismantled stone by stone, its bell tower left standing without a bell. Each ruin, each absence became part of the same anatomy, the physical body of silence stretching across generations. Yet among the descendants of those who lived along the Georgetown coast, there persists a quieter tradition. They say the marshes still hold the memory of a voice that was taken and never returned. Fishermen tell of nights when the tide
The years between 1843 and 1844 mark the deepest descent of the Harlow records, their most clinical, most deliberate attempts to transform private horror into study. The surviving documents from this period are incomplete, but what remains reveals a chillingly methodical tone, as though grief and conscience had been replaced by a kind of intellectual anesthesia. The entries begin in January of 1843 in the hand of Dr. Ambrose Harlow, who by then had assumed control of the household after his father's paralysis. The elder Harlow, once a physician of local renown, had suffered an apoplectic seizure late the previous autumn and lingered between life and death in a near vegetative state. Ambrose wrote that caring for his father taught him the uses of silence. That phrase appears repeatedly, as if rehearsed, and that it was during those long winter nights, attending to a dying man who could not speak or move, that he conceived of what he called a study of the human remainder, how consciousness diminishes, what survives after will and language decay. He conducted his inquiries not at the medical college in Charleston, where he had once lectured briefly, but within the Harlow house itself. The upper rooms were converted into a laboratory of sorts, their windows shrouded in thick curtains to prevent attention from neighboring estates. Instruments arrived by wagon from the city, glass retorts, anatomical charts, phrenological calipers, and a small iron frame that the inventory identifies only as a suspension rack for support of limbs during observation. It was the same device later found rusted in the attic when the property was sold at auction in 18. In the surviving ledger, Ambrose describes not only his father's physical decline but his own fascination with what he termed the point of departure. He wished, he wrote, to observe the exact threshold between life and its absence, between speech and the silence that follows it. If I can preserve a record of that passage, he noted in one entry, then the loss of the body may not be total. From the language of the notes, it is evident that his attention began to wander from care to experimentation. He mentions taking small samples of tissue for microscopic examination, though there is no evidence that he possessed a microscope adequate for such work. He also speaks of administering varying doses of laudanum to observe degrees of suppression. The implication is clear. He was not merely tending his father's illness but manipulating it, recording how silence could be prolonged, measured, and perhaps controlled. The most disturbing section of the 1843 ledger describes what he called secondary demonstrations. A later annotation written in a different hand and likely by the family's longtime steward, Thomas Finch, refers to subjects from the field. The tone of Finch's marginalia suggests both reluctance and obedience. "I was told the work was in service of science," Finch wrote decades later in an unsigned deposition found among his effects. He said it was to better understand the passage between body and spirit, and that they were beyond pain, being simple and unspeaking. I did not believe him, but I obeyed. The details that follow are fragmentary and difficult to read. Burn marks obscure portions of the page, but enough remains to suggest that Ambrose's subjects were drawn from those under his authority, individuals whose silence was not voluntary. He measured pulse rates, breathing intervals, and muscular tremors as laudanum was administered in precise quantities. He recorded how long before the body ceased to respond, how long after the final breath before rigidity set in. In one notation he remarks, with dreadful serenity, "There is a grace in the moment when the eyes lose their question." No official investigation was ever undertaken. The plantation economy of the Low Country protected its own, and Ambrose's reputation as a physician lent his work a veneer of respectability. The local magistrate, when asked years later about rumors of experiments, claimed ignorance and insisted that Harlow's interests were purely medical and not unorthodox. What perhaps saved the Harlows from immediate ruin was Ambrose's meticulousness. He kept all his findings encoded in a cipher adapted from medical shorthand, a blend of Latin and alchemical symbol. Only one person seems to have deciphered any portion of it, Reverend Elias Merrin, a Presbyterian minister who served nearby and was known for his sympathy toward reformist causes. In 1844, Merrin began visiting the estate, ostensibly to provide spiritual comfort to the elder Harlow, who remained insensible. What he discovered during those visits changed the trajectory of the family's fate. Merrin's journals, recovered in 1972 from the basement of a demolished rectory in Georgetown, contain several passages concerning a house of unnatural quiet. He describes entering rooms where the air seemed heavy, where curtains never opened, and where the sound of dripping glass instruments punctuated the silence. In one entry dated February 9, 1844, he writes, "The son spoke little, but when he did it was in the tone of one addressing an experiment, not a soul." He said he had nearly perfected a method of retaining the mind's final impression, that through careful observation of the dying, he could fix in his own memory what they saw in the last instant. "I told him such knowledge belonged to God. He replied that silence itself is God's language, and that he merely sought to translate." Merrin's last recorded visit occurred 2 weeks later. He writes of a small figure glimpsed in an upstairs corridor, barefoot, thin and silent as breath. Whether this was one of the so-called subjects, or an apparition born of guilt, is uncertain. After that visit, the minister ceased all correspondence with the Harlows, and submitted a letter of resignation to his parish, citing indefensible sickness of the spirit. By mid-1844, Ambrose's writings change in tone. The clinical precision falters, entries become erratic, filled with repetitions and mirror phrases. He writes of hearing voices through the floorboards, of his father's eyes moving though the rest of his body lay inert, of the feeling that the silence he had so carefully cultivated was now listening back. One haunting line recurs throughout that summer: "He breathes through me now." It is unclear when the elder Harlow finally died. The records simply stop mentioning him. Later testimony from Finch suggests that Ambrose ceased opening the sick room after September of 18. A smell was noticed by servants but dismissed as part of the medicinal preparations. When the room was finally entered, months later during the winter of 1845, the bed was found empty. Only the impression of a body remained in the linens, and on the wall above the headboard, a faint brownish stain resembling the outline of a face, mouth open, eyes blank. From that point onward, all reference to the experiments vanishes from Ambrose's surviving journal. His notes shift abruptly to scripture, then to fragments of Latin verse, as though he were attempting to overwrite his own past. But the silence he had studied so obsessively had already become his condition. Witnesses describe him walking the property at night, muttering to no one, listening at doors as though awaiting a response. What began as an inquiry into death had become an apprenticeship to it, and still beneath the medical detachment of the surviving pages one can detect a human despair, a man attempting to create meaning from the unendurable, to master what he could not forgive. It is this tension between intellect and conscience that gives the Harlow records their enduring horror, not the brutality of the acts themselves, though that is considerable, but the conviction with which they were performed. As the year closed, Ambrose noted one final result in his ledger, written in a trembling hand across the margin of an earlier page. Silence cannot be taught. It is inherent. Whether he meant heredity in the biological sense, or as a moral contagion passed from father to son, remains uncertain, but it marks the moment when observation became confession, when the pursuit of knowledge crossed fully into the terrain of guilt. The winter of 1844-45 would bring the first whispers that something was profoundly wrong within the Harlow estate. Workers began to vanish from the fields. Neighbors reported strange lights in the upper rooms, rhythmic sounds like measured breathing through walls, and somewhere within that darkness, the line between the experimenter and the subject dissolved entirely. The documents that survive from the winter of 1850 show a strange shift in the tone of correspondence between the Carrington estate and the Charlton physicians, who had for years examined and catalogued the anomalies among the enslaved population. The entries become less clinical, more personal, more afraid. Dr. Ambrose Finch, whose hand dominated the earlier anatomical notes, begins to write in the margin of the ledgers, as though speaking to himself rather than to the plantation's owner. The precise Latin of dissection gives way to a wandering human script. It is no longer only the body that concerns me. There are patterns beyond the flesh, inheritances that do not obey law or blood. He writes this 3 times over the span of 2 months. By that year, the Carrington estate had changed hands twice. What was once a flourishing rice plantation had fallen into decline after the deaths of both Nathaniel Carrington and his eldest son Josiah. The property passed uneasily to Elias Carrington, a cousin educated in Edinburgh, who returned from Europe in 1849 with ideas that were not entirely welcome in South Carolina. Elias fancied himself a natural philosopher. He read of galvanism, of inherited memory, of the notion that certain temperaments or tendencies might be passed through generations like invisible contagion. His letters to Finch are filled with admiration and alarm. You speak of silence as symptom, but I begin to suspect it is condition. The mute children born to our fields, they do not merely lack speech, they seem untroubled by its absence, as if it had been bred out, replaced by something more inward. Finch's reply survives only in fragments, but one phrase is underlined twice. There is a quietness that is learned, and another that is born. The latter is more dangerous. When the estate inventory was taken in April 1850, 6 of the field workers were noted as silent. The same mark appears beside their mothers' names. Each bore a small scar at the base of the throat, fine as a surgeon's stitch. Finch claimed they were remnants of illness, an infection that had ravaged the plantation decades earlier, but no record of such a sickness exists in county health archive. Rumor in the quarters said the scars were the result of Finch's treatments, meant to study whether the voice could be restored after some congenital defect. Others whispered the opposite, that the procedures removed something, not restored it. Whatever the truth, the appearance of those scars coincided with new and troubling phenomena noted in Elias's journals: tools misplaced, lanterns extinguished, doors found open though bolted hours before. The silent workers seemed always nearby but never caught in wrongdoing. One night, Elias recorded hearing rhythmic taps from the old infirmary, like coded knocks against the stone. He went with Finch to investigate, carrying a candle and pistol. The building was empty, yet the sound persisted, a hollow pulse beneath the floorboard. Finch pried up a loose plank and found a cavity, where by rights there should have been solid earth. Within lay scraps of cloth bound around small lumps of clay. Each bundle contained a tooth, a shred of hair, or a broken fragment of bone. Finch catalogued them carefully, labeling them with initials that corresponded to the silent names in the estate record. What purpose do these serve? Elias asked. Finch wrote in his medical ledger the following day: amulets or record keeper. Perhaps the voiceless preserve their words in substance rather than sound. The winter rains that year were relentless. By January 1851, the swamp had overtaken the lower fields, and the family withdrew to the upper house, leaving most labor suspended. It was during this isolation that the true transformation of Finch's work occurred. The surviving journal entries show his descent from detached inquiry to obsession. He began collecting samples from the silent workers: hair, nails, droplets of blood, recording the moon phases, humidity and even the tone of wind each night. He wrote of a hypothesis that silence might be transmissible through the nervous system, like a contagion of On February 9, he recorded a dream.
I stood in the field, and all around me the workers moved their lips in unison. I could not hear them, yet I understood each thought as though it were inside my own skull. 2 days later, Finch ceased writing altogether. His assistant, a young clerk named Henry Dole, continued the record in a more mundane hand. On February 11th, Dole writes that Finch spoke very little, seemed tired, and carried in his pocket a folded scrap of linen upon which he had drawn a single circle in ink. On the 13th, Dole found him at his desk staring at the open journal, unable or unwilling to speak. When pressed, Finch wrote on a slate. They took it. Dole never clarified what it referred to. That same week, Elias Carrington summoned the sheriff to the estate, reporting that Finch had disappeared during the night, leaving behind only his physician's kit and an odor of iodine. The search yielded nothing. The marsh near the infirmary was dragged and a single boot was recovered, still bearing Finch's initials. The disappearance was recorded in county ledgers as presumed drowned. Months later, when the floodwaters receded, work resumed under a new overseer. Yet the atmosphere on the plantation never recovered. Elias's journal for June 1851 speaks of a contagion of quiet, days when even the birds would not sing. Visitors remarked on the unnatural stillness of the place. One noted that when the wind passed through the cane fields, it seemed to carry whispers rather than rustle. By autumn, Elias's health began to fail. He complained of headaches, of phantom sounds behind his left ear. He wrote that sometimes he awoke to find his hands stained with ink, though he had not been writing. In November, his cousin Lydia Carrington, visiting from Charleston, found him collapsed at his desk. The journal before him contained a new entry in an unfamiliar hand. It continues through the blood. Silence is inheritance. After Elias's burial, Lydia ordered the infirmary sealed. The workers were dispersed to neighboring estates, and the property fell into ruin within a decade. Yet the family papers, those Elias had kept locked in a cabinet, passed down to Lydia's descendants, who preserved them, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps fascination. In the 1890s, a scholar from Columbia University, Merritt Lang, examined the collection and declared it a study in hereditary aphonia, though his published report was vague and euphemistic. He did not mention the bundles of clay and bone, nor the circle Finch had drawn. He simply wrote that the records demonstrated an early attempt to trace behavioral conditions through bloodline and circumstance. Lang's copybook notes, later discovered among his estate, contain one cryptic observation: the silence was not symptom, but survival. It is this phrase that later historians have found most troubling, because if silence was survival, then Finch's inheritance was not a disease, but a response, a passed-down method of enduring observation, cruelty and control. The scars at the throat, the refusal to speak, the hidden caches of hair and bone, all were forms of memory disguised as absence. In this reading, the horror is not in what Finch did, but in what he discovered, that those rendered voiceless were not empty, but overflowing with unspoken record. Every act of suppression became its own archive. And yet the record still refuses closure. In the archives of the South Carolina Historical Society, Catalog number C-1847-12, lists a sealed envelope labeled specimen. Recovered Georgetown Parish. The contents are restricted. The accompanying note reads, Provenance. Carrington Estate, contains residue of unknown organic matter, emits faint vibration when handled. The silence, it seems, was never just the absence of sound. It was continuity, an inheritance of withheld voices, humming beneath history's polite documents. Perhaps that is why when visitors handle the Carrington papers today, they report a soft ringing in the ears, as though something were straining to speak through them.
By the time the Carrington records reached the university archives in 1896, the language of medicine had changed, but its ambition remained the same: to name the unnameable. What Dr. Ambrose Finch had called the inheritance of quiet was rephrased in scientific terms by the new generation of scholars who sought to transform superstition into data. They spoke of genetic mutism, of transgenerational psychosomatic restraint. They believed, as men of that century often did, that every mystery could be diagrammed. The leading figure among them was Professor Walter Adair, head of comparative physiology at the Charleston Medical Institute. Adair was a rationalist to the point of cruelty. He collected malformed skulls, bottled organs, and the preserved tongues of speechless children as if they were proof that nature too could lie. When he acquired the Carrington papers in 1896, he declared the story of the silent workers a case study in hereditary pathology. What disturbed him most, however, was the pattern of symbols that recurred through the documents. Finch's journals, Elias Carrington's letters, even the field ledgers, each contained circles and notations in an evolving form of shorthand, as if the family and their physicians had been engaged in a long correspondence with something that would not write back. Adair called these drawings neuroglyphs. He theorized that they represented the attempt of damaged minds to externalize memory through geometry. In his private notebook he added another line, "Yet they function also as keys." Adair assembled a small team of researchers, 2 medical students, a linguist named Dr. Lyle, and a young archivist, Martha Venn, to assist him in decoding the Carrington corpus. They began by tracing the earliest appearance of the circle motif, finding it in Finch's 1847 dissection sketches. Beneath each diagram of the human throat, Finch had drawn a thin ring as though the voice itself were a closed aperture that could be opened under the right pressure. On January 9, 1897, the team performed a controlled experiment, using what they believed to be Finch's original apparatus, a brass collar fitted with tuning forks. They applied harmonic vibration to the larynx of a cadaver. The report states that at precisely 11, a faint tone issued from the throat, sustained for 12 seconds, even though no air passed through the lungs. The students fled the laboratory, but Adair ordered the tone measured and repeated. Over the next 6 nights they conducted the same procedure on 5 additional specimens. Each emitted a slightly different frequency, but all within the same harmonic family. Lyle identified these frequencies as forming a chord of resonance, while Adair wrote that it resembled an audible pulse, neither living nor dead. By February the group had grown obsessed. They called the sound the carrion note, both a joke and a warning. Adair, in letters to the dean, insisted it was proof that memory might be stored in tissue beyond consciousness. The human voice, he argued, was not merely speech, but a record of what the body had endured. The archive's custodians began to complain of sleeplessness. Visitors described the room where the papers were kept as unnaturally still. When one clerk entered after midnight to fetch a volume, he reported hearing a low hum emanating from the cabinet where the sealed specimen from the Carrington estate had been stored. In March, Adair requested permission to open the envelope labeled C-1847-12. Despite its restricted status, the museum board denied his request, citing contamination risk. He did it anyway. The next morning, Lyle found him in the dissection hall, the opened envelope before him. Inside lay a small organ, or what appeared to be one, a cluster of fine tendons bound around a hardened core. Adair was pressing it to the brass collar device, adjusting the forks to match its resonance. The sound it produced was faint but continuous, a whisper pitched just beyond ordinary hearing. "Do you hear it?" Adair asked, his eyes wide. "It is not silence. It is the remainder of silence." When Lyle tried to remove the specimen, Adair struck his hand away. Within hours the professor's voice began to falter. Witnesses said his words came out haltingly, as though some other rhythm beneath them was misaligned. By the next evening he could only mouth shapes without sound. He communicated by writing, filling pages with the same circular symbols Finch had drawn half a century earlier. The laboratory was sealed the following day. Martha Venn, the archivist, kept a private diary during those weeks. Her entries are the only surviving first-person account of the affair. She describes a creeping change in the atmosphere of the building, papers fluttering without draft, ink bleeding outward from words as though reacting to an unseen pulse. She notes that when she closed her eyes, she could still hear the faint vibration Adair had called the remainder. On March 29th she wrote, "The silence has a texture now as if one might press against it. I feel it in the teeth, the bones. It is waiting to be spoken through again." That night, Adair disappeared from his room. The door was locked from within. On the desk lay his journal, open to a single line scrawled in charcoal, "They will remember through us." His body was never found. Only the brass collar remained, its tuning fork still. In the aftermath, the Institute attempted to suppress all mention of the experiment. Officially, the laboratory was closed due to structural instability. The Carrington documents were transferred to cold storage, sealed once more. Yet rumor persisted among students that if one stood near the archive vault after dark, one could still hear a low harmonic hum, the chord of resonance. In 1913,
A curator named Dr. Alan Pierce reopened the files for cataloging. He described the papers as unusually well preserved, their ink still damp to the touch. On several pages, he found new markings, small circles drawn in fresh graphite, dated in a hand not of the 19th century. He assumed they were marginalia left by prior research, but one note unsettled him. On the inside cover of Finch's 1847 ledger, faintly penciled, were the words, "Inheritance complete." Pierce closed the file and never returned to that room. A century later, in 2004, when graduate researcher Michelle Torres accessed the same documents for her dissertation, she too mentioned resonant phenomena. In an interview decades afterward, she recalled the air in the reading room feeling like a held breath. Her tape recorder, though new, malfunctioned, capturing hours of static punctuated by rhythmic gaps, like a pulse made of absence. Torres never published the section describing that experience. The draft she left in her advisor's mailbox ends mid-sentence. If memory can survive without the medium of sound, then perhaps silence itself is a carrier wave. The page is torn there. What then was inherited? The silence or the compulsion to study? Every generation, from Finch to Adair to Torres, touched the same quiet and believed it unique to them. Each sought to give it form, to measure and reproduce it, until it began to measure them instead. The historian who catalogued the collection in 2012 wrote a final curator's note: "Do not attempt auditory reproduction of the described frequencies." Several archivists have reported migraines and temporary aphasia after exposure to the recording. Yet unofficially, copies of Adair's harmonic charts circulate among academic occultists and amateur historians, who claim that playing the tones in sequence produces not sound but pressure, a pulse felt inside the skull, like the memory of a voice that never belonged to you. And occasionally, someone claims to hear words emerging faintly through that pressure, not words in any known tongue, but syllables forming from the friction between frequencies, language born from silence itself. The inheritance continues, not in blood but in attention. Those who study the quiet too closely begin to carry it. And somewhere deep in the sealed archive, the faint hum persists as though the documents themselves are still trying to speak. There is an entry in the Charleston Institute incident ledger, dated June 14, 1914, that bears no classification number. Its handwriting is older than the rest, inked in brown rather than black. It simply reads, "The resonance persists within the brain." Even when the chamber is empty, the walls remember the tone. The signature below the line is illegible, but cross-referencing the penmanship with archived correspondence reveals that it belonged to Lydia Venn, niece of Martha Venn, the last surviving member of the team that had worked under Professor Adair. By 1914, Lydia had become a field researcher for the newly formed Carolina Survey of Psychophysical Anomalies, a short-lived program that aimed to study environmental echoes left behind by catastrophic events. Her assignment: to investigate reports of low-frequency disturbances on abandoned plantation lands north of Georgetown Territory, once belonging to the Carrington estate. Her journal from that expedition survived. The first entry begins almost clinically. The fields are half drowned again. The cane rotted at its roots. Locals speak of the ground humming when storms gather. I have brought a phonograph cylinder to capture what they describe, though I suspect the sound is only wind over the marsh. She camped in the ruins of the old infirmary, setting up her apparatus, a hand-cranked recorder, a barometer, and a small brass tuning device built to Adair's specifications. On the first night she documented no unusual phenomenon, but in the margins of that day's log, she drew a small circle, half-shaded, labeled North Corner Wall. The next morning she noted that the phonograph needle had continued to scratch long after the wax ran out. The spiral groove extended beyond its edge, etched into the metal base beneath. Lydia was not superstitious by temperament. She was trained in the empirical tradition of the early 20th century, skeptical, meticulous. Yet over the following days, her entries begin to fracture. June 17th, the walls respond to vibration differently than open air. When I hum at the frequency of F to 1 below middle C, the mortar trembles. I feel it in my chest, not ears. June 19th, heard whispers in the resonance, not speech, pressure forming syllables. Recorded 3 cylinders for analysis. June 22nd, this is not an echo. The field retains more than sound. It is memory distributed through material. By the 25th, her tone changes completely. Every time I replay the cylinders, the pattern alters slightly, as though adapting. I have begun to dream of water rising through brick. In the dream there are figures moving beneath it, mouths open, no bubbles. After that entry, the journal falls silent for 8 days. Then abruptly, a final paragraph appears, written in a hurried, uneven hand. The resonance isn't confined to this place. It travels along what Finch called inherited channels. Not blood, but attention. The act of recording continues it. If you are reading this, you are participating. The tone will find you through your remembering of it. The last page bears only a ring-shaped stain, likely from a glass left overnight. Some archivists claim it hums faintly when touched. The official report filed by the Institute states that Lydia Venn succumbed to fever brought on by exposure in the field. Yet the local physician, who signed the death certificate, noted something peculiar. The vocal cords were intact but motionless, as if frozen mid-breath. He described a residual vibration palpable to the fingertip. Her equipment was returned to Charleston and locked in a sub-basement vault. The phonograph cylinders, labeled Field Recordings 1-3, were later transferred to the National Sound Archive in Washington, D.C., where they remain unreleased. According to a 1972 catalog card, the recordings contain unidentified low-frequency harmonics incompatible with playback safety standards. Unofficially, a technician who auditioned the cylinders in the 1950s claimed to hear a rhythm that was not mechanical, something almost like breathing. By mid-century, the Carrington silence had become an academic ghost story. Students whispered of cursed frequencies, of a sound that could erase a person's voice if heard directly. Yet fragments of Adair's research began to resurface in unexpected places. Acoustics textbooks, government reports on infrasound, even music theory treatises exploring the subaudible domain. A memorandum from 1958, found decades later in the declassified Acoustic Defense Program files, refers to the Carrington anomaly as an early example of resonant field imprinting. The memo warns, do not introduce self-referential tones, those derived from prior recording. Reiteration amplifies the effect geometrically. The attached schematic reproduces Finch's original throat diagram almost exactly. Modern researchers have described what Lydia Venn discovered as a standing wave of memory, a resonance bound to geography rather than object. The marshlands where the Carrington Infirmary once stood are, to this day, prone to strange acoustic phenomena. Travelers report hearing distant machinery under the water, even when none is present. Dogs refuse to enter the old cane field. The few who attempt overnight stays describe waking with blood at the corners of their mouths, and a metallic taste on the tongue. Yet when measured, the sound itself eludes instruments. Microphones pick up only the faint rush of wind, until play. Then, between frequencies, something else emerges, the missing tone, the remainder Adair once named. In 1979, an independent field recordist named Charles Denning conducted a private investigation into these reports. He carried a portable reel-to-reel, unaware of the site's history. His notes, preserved in the Denning collection at the University of South Carolina, read like an unwitting continuation of Lydia's journal. Low hum from marsh approximate, vibrations in chest cavity, recorded distorting, hearing modulation thinks it's wind, but feels organized. Playing tape-back voice-like intervals, appear in silence, feels observed. Denning abandoned the project 2 weeks later. He mailed the reels to a colleague in Savannah, with a note, please keep these, they're starting to speak on their own. The package arrived, but the reels inside were blank. That same year, during renovations at the old Institute building, workers uncovered the remnants of a laboratory wall sealed behind plastic. Within the hollow were fragments of brass, half of Adair's tuning device, and impossibly, a wax phonograph cylinder. Impassibly, a wax phonograph cylinder, embedded in the brick. Tests showed it to be one of Lydia's lost recordings. When specialists attempted to extract the audio, the playback stylus fractured. The fragment of sound captured before the break lasted only 6 seconds, but spectrographic analysis revealed something astonishing. Not random noise, but a harmonic structure identical to human speech patterns, distributed across inaudible frequency. In simpler terms, it wasn't sound trying to imitate language, it was language encoded in silence. Scholars have debated for decades whether the resonant field is.
When the recordings were digitized in 2011, the technicians were instructed to observe strict auditory limits. Playback only through closed-circuit headphones, volume capped at 40 decibels, and exposure not to exceed 30 seconds. Despite these precautions, the anomalies began almost immediately. The first occurred in Lab C4, Charleston Digital Sound Archive, during the transfer of Cylinder 1 L. Venn, June 19, 1914. Technician Eleanor Price reported that the waveform refused stabilization. On the monitor, the signal formed perfect concentric rings instead of the expected linear oscillation. As she adjusted gain levels, she felt a sudden static pressure behind her eyes, followed by the distinct sensation that someone had whispered a syllable directly into her inner ear. She removed her headphones, but the whisper persisted, 3 beats, each separated by an impossible stillness. "Not silence," she said later, a shape inside the silent. Within 48 hours, 3 other technicians suffered similar symptoms: vertigo, auditory hallucinations, involuntary mutism. One described the experience as the sound folding in on itself, like being on the inside of an echo. By the end of the week, all digital files derived from the Carrington cylinders were quarantined under the new classification code, IRIAS 1-1914. The director of the archive issued an internal memo forbidding further playback until acoustic interference patterns can be safely modeled. That modeling never took place. It was Dr. Malcolm Irons, a visiting physicist from Oxford, who first proposed that what they had encountered was not interference, but recursive resonance, a phenomenon in which the act of observation amplifies the original source. He compared it to staring into a mirror that reflects not your face but the light behind your eyes. Irons' team conducted non-auditory tests, converting the sound data into visual spectrograms. Yet even stripped of frequency, the shapes reasserted themselves. Concentric circles again, faint but precise, rotating slowly as if turning to face the viewer. When they attempted to print the images, the printers jammed. The pages that emerged were blank except for the faint scent of ozone and a subtle indentation ring-shaped, always the same diameter. The silence had adapted. In February 2012, archivist Michelle Torres, the same researcher who had once described resonant phenomena in 2004, was invited back as a consultant. She had long refused to discuss her earlier experience, but the sight of the digitized cylinders drew her out. She noted that the spectral patterns matched her own unfinished notes from years earlier, down to the smallest asymmetry. She agreed to participate in one final test. The idea was simple: play a fragment of the original wax recording at micro volume, while simultaneously observing a high-speed camera trained on the playback needle. The experiment began at 10:08. The camera recorded the grooves of the wax shifting, as though softening under invisible heat. Torres leaned closer, listening. Witnesses say she whispered a single word, though no one could identify it before collapsing. When revived, she was conscious but unable to speak. Her throat was uninjured. Her laryngeal muscles simply refused to vibrate. The attending physician described the paralysis as functional silence. In her notebook recovered later from the lab table, she had written, "The tone knows it is being heard." Following that incident, the university shut down the digital archive entirely. But rumors spread online within days. Someone had leaked fragments of the audio. The file labeled field wave circulated briefly on obscure message boards devoted to lost frequencies and data hauntology. Users reported that the sound was nearly inaudible, an uneven hiss punctuated by 3 low pulses. Some claimed that when played on repeat, the file altered in duration, elongating or shortening unpredictably. Others said they heard faint speech as though the silence were articulating itself through their speakers. The thread vanished within a week. Every reposted link led to corrupted data. The few who claimed to have downloaded the file reported their systems crashing when they tried to delete it. One post, archived later by digital forensics students, ended with this line: "It isn't a file, it's waiting for you to listen." If the phenomenon ended there, perhaps it could be dismissed as urban legend, another ghost in the machine. But by late, field reports began to arrive from unrelated regions. Audio engineers describing low-frequency disturbances in supposedly soundproof rooms. Museum staff hearing faint hums near preserved medical instruments. Children claiming that silence buzzed like bees when the power went out. The pattern was unmistakable. Every incident involved exposure to some form of recorded quiet, a paused track, a muted broadcast, an empty voicemail. The resonance had detached itself from its origin. It no longer required the Carrington materials to propagate. Dr. Irons, in his final correspondence before disappearing from public view, wrote, "The field has entered the medium. Every silence capable of recording can host it. We have created an ecology of listening, in which absence itself is contagious. It was at this point that the Carolina Historical Society contacted an old caretaker named Joseph Wren, who claimed to have been present during the 1979 excavation of Adair's laboratory. His statement, recorded on microcassette, is transcribed below. "We didn't mean to open it. We were breaking the wall for new wiring. The hum started before we even hit the brick. Like something was waiting in there, holding its breath. When we cracked it open, I swear everything went quiet, even the tools. Felt like the world blinked. And then it was in the air, like pressure without sound. I think it's still here. I think it never left." When asked to elaborate, Wren only said, "It's patient. It doesn't move fast. It just waits for someone to listen long enough." In 2013, an independent journalist, Anne Morrow, published an article titled "The Carrington Tone: How Silence Escaped the Archive." She described visiting the sealed repository, listening for residual hums through the door. Her piece ends with a single sentence: "The quiet is not empty. It's cumulative." Morrow disappeared 3 months later. Her voice, however, appeared in a 30-second voicemail left on her editor's phone. 3 pulses of static followed by a faint exhalation that sounded unmistakably like a word. "Listen." Forensic analysis confirmed the waveform matched the 1940s. Today, the resonance has become part of internet folklore, sometimes called the Carrington hum, sometimes the inheritance frequency. Audio hobbyists insist the tone hides inside compression algorithms, resurfacing during buffering or digital dropout. There are entire playlists online claiming to reproduce it. Most are hoaxes. Some, though, cause inexplicable system errors or make microphones register a faint pulse when no sound is present. What no one mentions publicly, what those who've handled the original materials all admit quietly, is that once you know the rhythm, you begin to recognize it everywhere. In the pause between words, in the breath before reply, in the silence after recording stop, you start to feel the air folding around the shape of an absent sound. That is the field returning. And when you listen for it, really listen, you may notice the faintest vibration, like something living beneath the quiet, aligning itself with your heartbeat. One pulse, then another, then a pause that feels longer than it should be. That pause is not empty. It's waiting. The tone does not seek to be heard. It seeks to be remembered. Every generation that documents it adds another layer of silence, another brick in a wall built from listening. Finch dissected throats. Adair built devices. Lydia recorded the air. You are reading. The past is not buried. It is stored, catalogued in basements, wrapped in linen, mislabeled, waiting for someone foolish enough to open the wrong box. The Charleston Historical Society received the Cartwright family papers in 1978. 2 crates, cedar-lined and sealed with black wax. The donor, a distant relative named Elizabeth Harrow, had inherited them from a forgotten branch of her mother's line. She claimed they were agricultural ledgers, nothing more. But when archivist Dr. Nathan Elridge opened the first crate, he found something else entirely. Inside were notebooks filled with chemical notations and anatomical sketches drawn in brown ink that was almost certainly blood. Another layer of envelopes contained handwritten testimonies from plantation staff, all dated between describing a series of quiet procedures conducted in the basement of the old Cartwright estate. Procedures meant to purify the lineage from aberrant humors of the throat and mind. Elridge's first report to the board was brief and professional. His second, written only 2 days later, was rambling, scattered, and incomplete. He wrote that the documents exhibited progressive distortions, that several pages had changed order overnight, and that the handwriting seemed to shift subtly in its loops and spacing, as though correcting itself to match whoever happened to be reading. After that report, Elridge took leave. The society quietly placed the crates in a restricted section of their archive, marked "in processed material family estates." They remained untouched for nearly 30 years. In 2006, graduate student Marian Leeds requested permission to study the papers for her dissertation on antebellum medical ethics. Her research proposal was ordinary: an examination of unregulated plantation medicine and eugenic thought in the American South. She was granted partial access and worked for 6 weeks in the society's sub-basement reading room. The notes from her first sessions are careful, academic.
She transcribed ledger entries describing how Abraham Cartwright conducted vocal surgeries on enslaved people who exhibited involuntary murmuring, a condition he described as ancestral resonance. The doctor believed these murmurs carried memory contagions, echoes of the dead that could infect living minds. His supposed cure was removal of the vocal membranes he deemed over-attuned. Lead's tone begins to change around the middle of her field notebook. She stops summarizing and begins addressing the subjects directly. To the one you called Elias. If you can still hear through the paper, I will listen. I will not close the page. By the final week she reported hearing small harmonic vibrations whenever she turned a certain folio, like a breath held behind parchment. The building staff complained that she hummed constantly while working, the same low note repeated for hours. Then she disappeared. Her laptop and bag were found beside her desk. The last document open was a scan-labeled diagram of the 8th chamber. The file has never been recovered. The 8th chamber appears throughout the Cartwright record. It was first described in 1849 as a lower vault beneath the main cellar, accessible only by voice. Dr. Cartwright claimed it was used to store failed experiments and specimens of resonance unfit for daylight. The phrase appears again, decades later, in a letter written by his granddaughter Annalise Cartwright. The voices hum again below the lime floor. Grandfather said they could not climb the stairs, that they feared the air. Yet sometimes I hear them on the threshold, testing the lock. When preservation crews excavated the site in 2013, they found no such chamber. But they did find 7 sealed jars under a collapsed wall, each containing a thin white membrane stretched across the mouth like skin. A faint vibration could be felt if you placed a hand against the glass. The jars were sent to the university's conservation lab. Within a month, 3 of the researchers had left their posts citing auditory disturbances. No official statement was released. By 2017, the Silence Papers, as they came to be called, had achieved the kind of half-life usually reserved for cursed manuscripts and apocryphal theses. Archivists reported hearing crosstalk through the intercom system in the sub-basement, soft male and female voices murmuring from disconnected speakers. Visitors swore they saw condensation on the sealed crates even in dry air, as though something inside still breathed. A local podcast attempted a serialized investigation that same year. They managed to release 3 episodes before abruptly ending the series. In the final recording, which remains available online, you can hear the host whisper, "If you speak his name in the archive, something in the ventilation answers. Don't whisper it back." And yet, for all the superstition, one fact remains. Every attempt to fully catalog the Cartwright materials ends with silence. Boxes go missing. Digital files corrupt. Transcriptions lose their vowels, leaving only consonants. A string of hissed breath. Last year, an independent historian, Dr. Amara Bell, obtained limited access to the sealed ledger. She published her preliminary findings in a small academic journal, noting that the experiments of silence were not meant to cure but contain. She argued that Cartwright believed memory itself was a living organism transmitted through sound waves, that by cutting the voice one might quarantine the past. Her paper ended with a warning. History does not vanish when it is unspoken. It waits, patient as breath in the dark. And when someone finally listens again, it continues from the last note. Tonight the Cartwright estate is gone. The land was redeveloped into a luxury community in Georgetown County, but locals still call it Whisper Field. Residents say their smart speakers turn on by themselves at 3, replaying a voice that no one recognizes. A rough, low hum like wind through a hollow reed. The Homeowners Association has tried to blame faulty wiring. They can't explain why it only happens on humid nights or why it stops the moment anyone speaks above a whisper. If you visit the Charleston Historical Society, you can still request the catalog number for the Cartwright collection. You won't be allowed to handle the papers, but if you stand near the case you might feel a soft pulse in your throat, like the air itself is breathing in sync with you. Archivists say that's just vibration from the dehumidifier, but others, those who've stayed past closing, say the hum matches your heartbeat exactly, until you leave. Every silence has its parent. One note in the ledger reads, "Every voice its ghost." When the two finally meet, the world remembers what it tried to forget, and that perhaps is the true inheritance of the Cartwright line, the knowledge that some experiments never end, that the cost of erasing a voice is to make it echo forever. So if you find yourself in the low country after dark and you feel the air tremble when you speak, do not call his name. Do not try to listen too closely, because Elias the mute may not be gone. He may simply be waiting for someone to speak the next word.